Hi folks, welcome back. Thank you for watching. Please do hit subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really does help when you do that. So today folks, Happy New Year first and foremost. Welcome to 2023. But this is also the time when I typically unveil my new pedalboard onto the channel for use in demo videos during the coming year. And it's become something of a tradition for me to do this every 1st of January, to take my all analog pedalboard concept, which is how I personally like to do things, and make it as extreme as I possibly can, whilst also making it a snapshot of who I am as a player at this particular point in time. Because of course, as guitarists, we all change and evolve. We might learn to love new sounds or slightly go off older ones or discover new bits of gear. And sometimes it's just nice to have a change. Roll the dice, get some new pedals on the board and see if it can draw new things out of us as players. So what I'm going to do today, folks, is first and foremost unveil this monster board, talk you through a bit of the philosophy behind why I've built it the way I have and what I was trying to achieve, what's changed since last year's board. Then go through each of the pedals and show you how they sound, how I've got them set and how I'm using them, and at the end do a bit of extended playing, layer some things together, just get really creative by stacking amazing analog gear and see whether inspiration does or does not strike. So without further ado folks, here is the 2023 all analog pedalboard, and hopefully it's as ridiculous and over the top as you've come to expect from me, because everything is super packed in. There is a ton of functionality in this board. You might spot that in some places the plastic protectors on the George L patch leads are missing because the 1mm difference that made allowed that part of the board to work. So everything is super crammed, but it was a lot of fun putting this thing together, albeit a bit of a headache making sure everything worked as it should. So what's changed from last year's board then? Well, in recent years, I've been very fond of running two amplifiers at the same time, mainly for recording, but also for demo videos. Because if you take an amp of a certain tonal quality and pair it with an amp of a slightly opposing tonal quality, the two kind of slot together and fill in the gaps that each of them leave, and it gives you a really fat, full frequency sound. But recently I've found that I can achieve much the same effect using a 2x12 cabinet with different speakers in it. And if you take a bright thin speaker and a dark thick speaker and pair them together, again they kind of colour in where the other leaves off and gives you that kind of dual amp sound with just one amp. And in a room this size, cranking a 30-watt tube amp will rip your eardrums out, but cranking two 30-watt tube amps will knock a wall down and severely aggravate the neighbours. So being able to do it at a slightly lower volume is very preferable. Now, to effectively run two amplifiers at the same time, I've always ended my board with a buffered splitter, which gives me two completely isolated phase reversible signals to go into the amps and stop ground loop hum and all of that. But last year, I think I used the dual outputs from the board twice, if that. So this year, given how little I'm using it nowadays, it didn't seem sensible to hardwire that into the board. So the dual outputs have gone, replaced with a single output on the patch bay going off to the amp, and I've just kind of stripped that back a little bit. If I ever want to use the two amps, I've got a Layla P-split. I can run the board into that, and I've got two isolated outputs there for the one time I might actually use it. So that's gone. Something else that's gone is the send to my strobe. Now, I love my old 70s Peterson strobe. It's super accurate for tuning, but I've just been plugging the guitar straight into the strobe. I think last year I probably used the send from the board that I set up, again maybe once or twice at most. So this loop here has been relabeled from tuner to mute, because this is now just a kill switch. If I ever want that functionality back, it's just a single patch lead from here to the patch bay, and then I connect the strobe and happy days. But again, it didn't seem any point putting that cable in there if I just wanted to function as a kill switch, basically. Now, the other thing that's really changed in the last few years is I've got really into just cranked amp sounds, plugging the guitar into an amp and diming it and doing it old school on the volume control. And I said in last year's Pedalboard build that the 2021 board, I built it up and basically didn't use it the whole year. I was just going straight into the front end. Now, happy to say I used the 2022 board a lot more. But as part of that journey, I've got really into tube pedals. Now, those pedals come with their own fairly extreme power requirements, because whereas a fuzz will run on a 9-volt power supply and draw 4 milliamps, a tube pedal will typically want a 12-volt power supply and draw 600 milliamps, which can be a bit of a problem. Now, for the last few years, I've used the modular gig rig generator power system for the entire board. And within that, you can get high current adapters to give you 12 volt at high current for tube pedals. Happy days. But what I did spot last year was with the amount of high current adapters I was using, these quartermaster switches, they draw more current the more loops you turn on. And if I turned on more than 3 or 4 loops, the gig rig generator would buzz and fizz and sound like it was about to go into outer space. So I think I was right at the upper limit of what that generator could sort of safely handle. And this year I've gone with even more glassware in the pedals than I had last year. So to facilitate that and do it all safely, I'm now using 2 power supplies together. So the vast majority of the board is still running on the gig rig modular system. Everything has good, clean, fully isolated power at the correct voltage and the correct current. But the 2 Kingsley pedals, the Effectrode PC2A tube compressor and the Audio Kitchen small trees, they are now running on an Effectrode atomic power supply which sits underneath the gig rig, because that is designed specifically to power tube pedals. It gives you 4 output at high current and it's designed to do the job that I want it to do. So by doing that, the tube pedals are all happy and it just takes some of the strain off the gig rig. I can now turn on all the loops at once if I want to, and nothing's going to go bang. So I did have to up my power game this year to really make this thing work. But I think that's the philosophy behind the board, and I better show you how it all sounds really. So this is the guitar I'm going to use for the demo today. You may have seen this in a video a couple of months, or a couple of weeks ago actually, because this is my old Japanese 52 reissue, which is a real workhorse guitar for me, but it was getting pretty tired and it was a real handful to play. So I took it to Matt Gleason at Monty's Guitars in Cheltenham, who refretted it and gave it a proper setup and made it play good, which was great on its own, but he also heavily modified it, chopped the Callahan bridge down, routed out underneath here, made a custom pickguard, mainly to accommodate his brand new wide range humbuckers. Now I've spent a few weeks getting to know these pickups and they are absolutely stunning. So I am absolutely loving how this guitar sounds and looks and plays. So I'm going to use this for the demo today. In terms of amp, I'm going to use my RYRA JTM 45 clone, which is by far and away my favourite amp I've ever played, let alone owned. It's an incredible premium quality hand-wired JTM 45, KT66 tubes, tube rectified. It's just, for me and what I do, the ultimate amplifier. It sounds amazing clean, it sounds especially good cranked, but I'm going to be running it very loud but clean today. Now the cabinet is a 2x12 Zilla Studio Pro. This is the cabinet I use for pretty much all of my demos I shoot on the channel. And the speakers in this cab have changed in the last couple of weeks actually. I'm still using the Celestion Alnico Gold, but I'm now pairing it with the brand new Fane A30 Alnico. Now, if you saw my Celestion and Fane comparison video a couple of weeks back, you will have seen that the Gold and the A30 together is just magic. And there's something about that pairing, again, sort of just slotting together and being more of the sum of its parts. That cab is now making all of my amps sound my favourite I've ever had them sounding. Something happens with those 2 speakers and it's just sounding amazing. So that's the guitar, the amp and the cab. The only thing left is the pedalboard. So let's move on to that. So the guitar comes into the patch bay on the left, and the first thing it hits is the Audio Kitchen Small Trees, which, unless I'm using a transistor-based pedal like a fuzz or a Rangemaster, that's always on. And it's acting as a tube buffer, slight boost, line driver, and just slight tone enhancer. So that's always on, and after that the signal goes through the quartermasters and off to the amp. So if none of the loops are turned on, the signal goes guitar, small trees, amplifier. So that on its own sounds like this. So that's a guitar sound I like. It has weight to it, but more than anything, it has clarity and definition in the top end. And the small trees really helps me with that. Now today I'm using a guitar with humbuckers in, and I've deliberately used a very long cable run off to the amp that's coiled up over there, just to kind of break the distance over to the amps, because I wanted to show you what effect a good buffer can have on an entire guitar rig. So I won't engage any other pedals, but I'm going to kick the small trees in and out to show you what effect all that capacitance has on your guitar signal and how a buffer can help with that. So I'm giving it a slight level boost there, but more than anything else, it's retaining the top end. It's not adding top end, it's stopping top end getting lost as it travels down through the cable. That is capacitance in action. And using a buffer to drop the impedance of your guitar signal down on the front end can help massively with keeping everything bright and defined and sounding really glossy and posh through a large rig such as this. But what I'm going to do next is turn the small trees off, because the first loop here is a Rangemaster, and this has a germanium transistor in it which wants to see a high impedance direct connection to your guitar, and if you stick a buffer in the middle of that, it can make it go all a bit screwy. Now the Rangemaster I've got here is the Williams Audio Ranger. Now this is a very limited edition version of his standard Ranger. I think he made about 10 or 20 of these, because inside here is a new old stock Mullard OC44 yellow jacket germanium transistor, which is the transistor the original Rangemasters would have had in them. It's the one you want. Now Rangemasters typically sound a little bit questionable into clean amps. They work much more going into a gain stage, which I will show you later. But this one does sound really nice on its own. It has a switch so you can add low end back in if you want to. I've got mine in just standard Rangemaster mode. But for that kind of Rory Gallagher type thing, it's really, really nice. So, as I said, it will sound better going into a gain stage rather than the clean amp, but for the Rory thing, it's lovely. Now, I'm going to leave the small trees turned off because the next loop is my fuzz loop, and I've got 3 fuzzers in here. Now, I should say that with everything on this board, where the pedal is a clone of an old circuit, I've gone with the ultimate version of that circuit that is currently available. And when we're talking pedals with transistors in, like old fuzzers, I've gone with the ultimate transistors that you've ever been able to get in those circuits. So I've gone all out this year to make this as glossy and high-end as I possibly can. Now, just like the Ranger, regulars to this channel will know how much I love Williams audio. Nick makes some of the best Tonebenders ever. And his Mark I Tonebender is my favourite fuzz I have ever played. but he's recently souped up my Mark II with a trio of new old stock Mullard OC81D transistors, which are what the original Mark IIs had in them. They are the Jimmy Page thing, if you're into that sort of thing. So the great thing about Williams Audio Tonebenders is they're all the same size and shape with the same power requirements, so I can swap the Mark II out for the Mark I in about 10 seconds should I ever want to. But I decided to start the year with the Mark II because with these transistors in especially, it just sounds incredible. So I love the Mark I, but the Mark II with those OC81s in is really exciting me at the moment. So I thought, let's give it a go for the time being and see how we get on. Now, the second fuzz in the loop here is my good old Analog.Man Sun Face. Incredible fuzz face clone. I've tried lots of fuzz faces. Nothing's been able to kick this off the board. It's just my favourite. And this has the germanium NKT red dot transistors in it, which, according to Analog Mic, are exactly the same as the old red dot NKT 275s. They were just made for a different customer back in the 60s, so don't have the 275 on the end. But sonically especially, they're just the same. And of course the NKT 275s are the transistor for the fuzz face. And it just gives you that dark, warm, woolly, smoky Hendrix thing. It sounds as you want a fuzz face to sound. I love that pedal so much, and as I said, nothing has ever been able to kick that off the board pretty much. Now the final pedal here is one you might have seen on the channel previously, but not very often. This is made by Jam Pedals, and this is their black Muck. Now you may have come across the red Muck, which is their take on the Big Muff. This is a super limited edition they put out a few years ago. I think they only made 100 of them from memory. And it contains some really weird old 1960s transistors. From memory, I don't think even Jam knew what they were, but they give this pedal a sound, and it's a really, really great one. Still sounds like a Big Muff. Compared to my Williams Audio Ram Fuzz, this has a slightly more thick, lower mid-range, but it just has a wonderful sound. I dug it out a few weeks ago to include in the video, and just fell back in love with the thing and put it straight on the board. I also don't have any more Jam pedals on the board this year, and I love Jam pedals, so I wanted to make sure this was on there, and it just sounds ridiculous. Couldn't resist. Yeah, it's just a phenomenal sounding fuzz, and yeah, very happy to have that one on the board. Now we're moving on from transistor land now, so I'm going to put the small trees back on to retain all that nice top end, because we're moving into compression territory. Now for me, for a compressor to work for me, I need it to be running in parallel, creating kind of wet dry compression, as it were, parallel compression in the studio world. And I absolutely love the PC2A tube compressor. but I really wish it had a kind of dry blend control. And last year I went to using this pedal on the board, the Origin Effects Cali 76, because this has the dry knob to bring the uncompressed sound back in, and I thought, you know, let's try this. But in the end, I really missed the sound of the PC2A because it's just a phenomenal sounding compressor. Dropped my plectrum. And the way I've solved the parallel compression issue previously is by running it in the loop of a gig rig wet box, which is exactly what I've done this year too. So the wet box allows me to blend between my clean guitar signal and a fully compressed signal and achieve parallel compression. So I can have all the snap of my transients, but the clean overdrive sustain of a heavily compressed signal. Now, also in this loop, on the compressed side of the wet-dry signal, I'm running the output of the compressor into the Lightning Boy 2020 instrument transformer. Now, I'm still not over this thing. If you followed this channel for a while, you will have seen I've had this on the last few pedal boards, and I demoed it, well, back in 2020, presumably. And basically it's completely passive, so it doesn't require any power, but inside it is a hand-wound audio-grade transformer, like outboard preamps would have in the studio. And the basic idea behind it is you can run your guitar or your effects through one or more of these units to kind of add a bit of transformer saturation and coloration to your sound. But if you've watched that previous video, you will have seen that the effect it has is basically negligible. And when I had it in a loop, switching it in and out, I wasn't sure whether the sound change that was happening, which was tiny, was down to the pedal or the capacitance of the patch leads going in and out of the pedal. It was that slight. So the compressor is based on an LA2A, which is a piece of studio gear. So if I'm going to put it anywhere, it makes sense to have the transformer in the kind of studio gear territory. Is in there, it's not really doing anything, but in my weird brain, the more pedal boards I include this pedal on, the more value for money I might be getting. I told you I'm over it. But anyway, it's there, it's not really doing much, but I had space for it, it didn't require any power, so there we go. Now, the way I set my compressor is if I'm digging into the guitar, I don't want to really hear or feel the compressor, but if I'm playing lightly, I do. So running it in parallel, the way I have it set, if I strum something and kick the compressor in and out, hopefully you can't really hear it. So you can hear a slight change, but really not very much. But watch what happens if I do some light picking. So it takes the quiet parts and boosts them up without really affecting too much the sound of the loud bits. And that is what makes the compressor work for me. A lot of people like that super squishy, very obviously compressed Dynacomp type thing. I like it to be a bit more, dare I say the word, transparent. That's what makes it really work for me. So you can dig into the guitar, you almost don't know it's there, but if you back off your playing or you half fret a note and miss it slightly, the compressor's got your back and it will just bring it up and smooth it over. That's where compression really works for me as a playing and a studio tool. Right, the next boost here I've very affectionately called Billy G, because there's two pedals in this loop that are, in a roundabout way, linked to the bearded legend himself, Mr. Billy Gibbons. Now, the second pedal in the loop is the Origin Effects Magma 57, which is basically a magnetone in a box. That's the concept behind it. And I have that set for a kind of low but aggressive tweedy overdrive type sound. And of course you can turn the magnetone vibrato effect on as well, which is lovely. So that's the Magma 57, kind of a tweedy type thing. And of course, nowadays, Billy uses Magnatone amps, so there's the link there. But in the front end of that, I've got the fairly new Decibelics Reverend, which is a super high quality reproduction of the old Bixonic Expandora. It has kind of it's like a greatest hits. It has the key features from all 3 versions included in that pedal. Now, Billy very heavily used the Expandora, hence why it's grouped together with the Magnatone style pedal. And on its own, it has a very gnarly sound. But watch what happens if I engage the Magma and then stack the Reverend into the front end. It's really gainy, but it's very honky and middly. And it puts me in mind a little bit of Billy. I don't sound like Billy, of course I don't, especially with this guitar and this rig. But it puts me in that sort of mindset. So way more gain than I think Billy's used in his life, but it's that sort of sound, and it made sense to group them together, and I really love how they stack. They're great pedals, those. Now, next up is my mid-boost loop. So these are 2 mid-pushed overdrives. I tend to use them more as boosts. So I have a Clone style pedal and a Tube Screamer style pedal. So the Clone, with a K, that I use, is another Decibelics pedal, because gear makes outstanding gear. This is the Golden Horse, which is, depending on who you ask, the best clone out there. If you're a Clone aficionado, this is the one you want. It's got the correct mythical diodes and all of that. It just sounds right. Now, I actually run the gain on my Clone up quite a way. I don't do the clean boost thing because I want to hear the mythical diodes that I paid for. And I really love how a Clone sounds when it's gainy. It's a hard-edged kind of distortion, but still kind of clean because of how the gain works, blending the clean and the gain together. It's just a really useful studio tool. So it's harsh, it's nasal, but in all the right ways. That's why we love the Clone Centaur. Now, the second mid boost here is the RYRA 808, which is a slightly different direction for me this year. I've always used the Jam Tube Dreamer 58 for all of my Tube Screamer needs. It clips asymmetrically and it's just a little bit different. Whereas the 808 here is a like-for-like replica of the old TS 808. And it just has that classic sound that we know and love. So it's really loud here in the room, and that's definitely going into feedback there. But it's that kind of lower mid, sort of slightly softer attack than the Klon. It's a classic overdrive sound, and I'm really getting into that nowadays. Now, the next loop here is the modulation loop, and I'm going to put the compressor back on just because it makes modulation sound really smooth and glassy. The first modulation I have here is one that's been on the board for quite a while. It's the Retro Sonic Flanger. Very, very accurate recreation of the old 18-volt electric Mistress thing. Compared to my original, it sounds pretty much identical, but with a massively lower noise floor. It nails that glassy, watery top end type thing in a way that most other Mistress alikes do not. But it's incredible, this thing, especially for this particular chord here. Just the sound of ages. Is the only flanger I ever really want on the board. There's plenty of other great circuits out there like the MkII and the ADA, but the Mistress just does it for me. Now, the second pedal in this loop is a phaser, and this is a different direction for me this year. This is the Crazy Tube Circuits Cyclone. Now, in terms of phasers, I've always been a phase 90 guy. One knob, set it, and phase. That's all I've wanted. But I've recently been listening to a lot of Joe Walsh, as I do all the time. And I've really been getting into his phaser sound. I'm not sure exactly which pedal it is he used on albums like But Seriously Folks and things. But it has the feedback. It's not as extreme as a Small Stone with the colour switch on. But it has that kind of watery top end, a bit like the Electric Mistress. So basically what I wanted was a phase 90 with feedback. And I can dial in that exact sound with the Cyclone. It does plenty more besides. You've got a phase 45, a phase 90, a Small Stone, and the old Love Tone phaser in there. But I just use it on a phase 90 type sound with some feedback, still fairly subtle, but it is absolutely lovely. So, a classic phaser with all the functionality you could want. I'm just scratching the surface of what it can do. But a great pedal that really impressed me when I demoed it. Now, the final pedal in this loop here is a chorus, and I've gone a very different direction with chorus this year because I've had this pedal on pretty much every board I've ever built, the Analog.Man Mini Chorus. Probably my favourite chorus pedal, a modern one at least. It might go back on the board at some point soon. I absolutely adore this thing. But I demoed the PastFX PX65 a few months ago. And to me, comparing it to the Analog.Man, which is based on the small clone, this is based on the old DoD. This is a more stereotypically 80s bright shimmery chorus thing. But I'm really, really enjoying it. So I wanted to give it a shot on the board. Again, just cast the line out, see if anything interesting happens. I might go back to the Analog.Man at some point, but I wanted to give this a go. But for those old kind of Alex Lifeson Rush things, it's just lovely. very down by the seaside, but it's just amazing. It really, chorus gets a bad reputation. I want to bring it back because I love chorus. I really do. Right, let's move on to some gain now, shall we? The first pedal here is a tube gain pedal, but it's running at starved voltage, which to me, that typically means super saggy low end, really spluttery, Velcro fuzz-like misbehaviour. Not this one though, because this is the Hagerman VALVE. And again, I demoed this not too long ago and it really impressed me. It sounded great, especially on bass, it sounded lovely. But it was quite a warm, thick boost. Now I was talking to Jim after I shot that video and I said, it sounds great, love it on bass. I just kind of wish it was more open at the top end. And he said, well, I used this particular filter cap in there, whatever that was. If I show you what to remove, if you've got a soldering iron, take it out, that will get rid of all the filtering and just leave the top end wide open like you want. And I could be wrong. He's either reduced the filtering in the top end or got rid of that completely. So this might be exactly as the production unit sounds. I need to double check on that. This is also a prototype version. The production has a bar going over the tube. So when you jump off the drum riser and land on the pedal, you don't smash the tube up. So I need to be a little bit careful, but of course it's in a looper, so I don't need to actually jump on the pedal. But I use this mainly boosting into other pedals rather than on its own. But it can sound great on its own. It just really fattens things up in a really lovely way. It's got a little bit of that spongy low end starved voltage thing, but nowhere near as much as I was expecting, because this is running on a gig rig isolator, standard power requirement. You could almost, if you wanted to, you could run this on a 9-volt battery. The battery wouldn't last very long because it's still 135 milliamps, but you could run a tube pedal on a 9-volt battery, which is kind of unheard of when it sounds like this. That's a low starved voltage tube pedal and it sounds amazing. So as I said, I use it to boost into other things primarily, which I'll show you later on. But I really wanted to have it on the board. To be honest, I wanted to have this on the board, his blue tube overdrive. This sounds incredible, but there had to be sacrifices made in terms of size and space and power requirements and all of that. And I really wanted the Hagerman pedal on the board because he makes some incredible stuff. Now, moving on to the second Quartermaster then, which is of course sat on top of the first this year rather than going all along the front to make room for a massive pedal which we will move on to shortly. The first pedal here is the Kingsley Page. Now, if I could only have one overdrive pedal to last me the rest of my life, I think it would be this one. Because even though it's fairly simple and it kind of sounds as it sounds to a point, it's just perfectly voiced and I love it. It's kind of low middly to a point, but it has a real kind of sizzle on the top end. It's just amazing. Just a ridiculously good pedal out. Now, the next pedal is another Kingsley, and this is the Jester. And this one has the Sizzle mod to make the top end a little bit more zingy. And I'm setting this very differently this year to as I have done previously, because I've been really enjoying the high gain sounds in this pedal. I'm a clean, low, medium gain player at most. but I've been setting this really gainy and really enjoying playing around with it because it's a very smooth sounding overdrive, this. And it puts me in mind a little bit, and of course I can't play like him to save my life, as you'll know. It puts me in mind of that sort of Steve Vai thing. Very gainy, but not bright and abrasive. It's quite comfortable to listen to for a long period of time as a high gain guitar tone. With this guitar especially, this is a bright guitar, it's not going to sound like Vai. But it puts you in mind of that sort of thing. So it's that smooth high gain thing. It doesn't sound like Steve Vai, I know. You don't need to comment me and tell me I'm useless at doing a Steve Vai impression, I'm well aware of that. But it's that sort of idea, the smooth high gain overdrive thing. But the Page and the Jester just do everything I could possibly want in overdrive terms, especially when boosted with the Hagerman, which I'll show you in a bit. Now, delays. I have 3 delay pedals on the board this year, which I think is a personal record. The first one here is one I've wanted to check out for ages, and I've only had it a couple of weeks, so I'm still getting to know it, and I'm barely scratching the surface of what it can do. But this is the Analog.Man ADG1 from Asheville Music Tools. And this was designed by a chap called Hawker, who I believe is the guy responsible for those old massive kind of modular Moog delay things. He really knows analog delay circuits. And it's really surprised me looking at delay pedals recently. In the boutique world, it's very hard to find a simple analog bucket brigade delay with modulation on the repeats. It's really hard. You've got the Memory Man, the carbon copy with the modulation switch. You can get the digital controller for like the ARDX20 and things like that. It's actually really tough to find a boutique delay with modulation on the repeats as a simple BBD delay. It's really hard. But anyway, this one sounds incredible. It has a very powerful sort of tone filter control on the repeats. So you can darken it up to be more like a DM2, make it brighter, to sound more like a tape delay. But it's super high headroom, it doesn't really distort, and it is just a killer sounding thing. Now, one thing I love about this pedal is I recorded a Christmas song back in 2016, I think, and there was a guitar part over the intro that I used my old Memory Man for. It wasn't an old one, it was like one of the ones in that size enclosure, not a big box. And it was a sound I really loved, and I ended up selling the Memory Man, and I haven't really missed it, to be honest. But it was that one sound I've always wished I could recreate, and this does it. And it's basically this sort of like wobbly analog delay sound. I've not been able to get anything else to do that, and this does it. So I'm loving that about it so far. Now, also in this loop, so I'm going to turn off the ADG1, we have my old favourite, the Fairfield Circuitry Meet Maude. And I've got this set to do a similar type thing to as I've got the ADG1 set to do. That kind of washy, soundscapey kind of cushion underneath what you're playing. sort of thing. But for me, the real magic of this setup is when you stack the ADG1 into the Maude, because then you have two delays chained together, and one's kind of feeding off the other. But with the mix set low, you can still play. It doesn't overpower things, but it just gives you this cloud to sit on and noodle over the top of. It is lovely. So the two together almost give you that kind of like multi-head Binson drum delay type thing. Very, very cool. Now the next delay here is a more meat and potatoes Analog.Man ARDX20. It does one thing, but it does it very, very well, and you get the two sides. So I haven't got anything in the loop this year, because last year I had modulations affecting the repeats in the effects loop. Not using that this year, it's just a straight DM2-ish analog delay. So side A here is where I tend to live, and I've set the blend quite low on this. Delay time wise, I'm doing that kind of edge type thing, but the level's down quite low so I can use it with gain. So if I bring the Jester back in, you'll see what I mean. For that kind of, again, sort of Vi type thing. So it doesn't get too messy. That's what I was trying to avoid there by setting the level down. Now, side B on here, I've got set to do a slap back, which I don't do very often, but for that kind of... sort of thing. It's there if I want it. It can be nice to experiment with sometimes, but I tend to leave it on side A as my basic analog delay, kind of do-it-all delay type thing for the board. Now, on to the final two loops. We're nearly there, folks, don't worry. Now, this loop here is a tremolo. Now, I'm not a massive tremolo lover or user, but I wanted to have one on the board, and about the best I found for me is the Thorpy Chain Home. I've got it set very subtle, but it just adds some movement to everything. Nothing fancy, just a bit of subtle chop. And finally, the bane of my life for laying this board out this year. This is a reverb. And on the right, we have the Surfybear Metal, which is a real analog reverb tank in a box, in the Fender 5G15 vein type thing. Now, this does the surfy thing, of course it does, the clue's in the name there. I have this set much more subtly. So for me, it's doing as you would in a combo amp as a kind of always-on drop shadow type effect, but it does it incredibly well. Now, of course, it will do the surfy, Dick Dale, drippy thing if you set it right. I don't even think with the settings I've got I can make it do that. Not really, but it will do that. I'm using it much more tastefully. But I really wanted a reverb on the board this year. I did kind of miss it last year. So there we are, folks. That is the board, and that's what everything does. So as I said in the intro, a huge amount of functionality, but it's all analog, and I can achieve those sounds without fancy multi effects, which is some people's bag. That's great, good luck to you. But I like doing it like this. This is the gear that inspires me. And that's exactly what I'm going to try and do now. I'm just going to turn some pedals on and play and see what comes out. So this could be incredibly messy, or it could be really nice. We're about to find out. So let's make some noise with this thing. Here we go. there we are, folks. Now, that was a complete car crash at the end, right? And yes, I turned on every single loop purely to see whether the gig rig generator would explode or not, and it didn't, so that's handy. Now, those sorts of sounds that I was getting at the end there, the heavy saturation, kind of post-rock soundscape ambient type thing, that is not my happy place whatsoever. I feel really uncomfortable trying to play those sorts of sounds. But that's also exactly the point and exactly why I build such a ridiculous board each year. Because I'm a guitar into a JTM 45 guy. I like to keep it as simplistic as possible most of the time. But you do tend to fall into a bit of a rut in your playing when you do that. You get over comfortable and over familiar. Plugging into something like this and just hitting buttons and seeing what happens. Lots of those sounds that came out in that last bit of playing there, I'd never heard or played before in my entire life. I just hit buttons and kind of reacted to what the tone was telling me to play. And I was playing things completely different to what I would usually play, plugging this straight into an amp. And that's why I do this board. It's that inspiration factor. It's throwing myself as far out of my tonal comfort zone as I possibly can and seeing if anything interesting happens. Yes, a lot of the time it's a complete mess, especially with unpotted humbuckers with a lot of gain. Of course, we're going to get microphonic feedback doing that, won't we, kids? But those sorts of sounds just make me do and play things that I'm not prepared for. And every now and again, something happens. That's the inspiration factor for a song, or that's the key part of this guitar part I'm trying to write for somebody else's song, or whatever. That's what this board is for. It's fun primarily, but it's also a creative tool to really inspire me to play differently. That's why I do this board every year. But that's just me, folks, the all analog 2023 pedal board. Please do comment underneath and let me know your thoughts. I know it's excessive, so you don't need to tell me that, but let me know which pedals were your favourite, which tones today were your favourite when I was layering things up. What do you think of this crazy, crazy guitar? I love chatting nerdy guitar stuff with you folks down in the comments section. So thank you ever so much for watching, folks, and sticking with me through this very, very long video. I hope everyone's hangovers aren't too bad this morning. And yeah, please do carry on subscribing. I always say it, but it makes a huge difference when you hit subscribe. And I will see you for another video very, very soon. Bye-bye.